Hey, welcome to this episode of Shepherd Leaders Network. I'm Jimmy Disney. I am the host of Shepherd Leaders Network. Glad that you joined us today. This channel is dedicated to church leaders who desire to be leaders, because all of us can be better leaders and should be striving to be better leaders. The Shepherd Leaders Network exists to develop more effective church leaders who mobilize and equip people for ministry, strengthen churches to accomplish the Great Commission. I believe that God has called all believers to be engaged in ministry, and that He's called church leaders to equip people for the work of ministry. Now, today we're going to be talking about the leader in the mirror. Here's a big question I want to ask you, something I want you to think about and sit with for just a second before you even respond. What is it like to sit under your leadership? When was the last time someone on your team told you honestly how you're doing as a leader? I'm not talking about a polite thumbs up to a text. I'm not talking about a quick response just as you're passing someone by. But when was the last time someone gave you honest feedback about what it's actually like to be led by you? This could be a question for a staff member. Depending on your situation, this may be a question that you ask a volunteer. But literally, when was the last time you got honest feedback about what it's like to be led by you? Now, here's the reason this question is so important. Most leaders do not know the answer to this question. Now, I want you to know as we're getting started today, this is not a character flaw. This is, by its definition, a blind spot, because there is a gap. Research tells us there is a gap between how people actually think they're leading and how their leadership is perceived by those that they're leading. So that's what this episode is all about. It's talking about the leader in the mirror. I want you to know the leader in the mirror, looking in the mirror to discover who you actually are today as a leader, is essential in becoming a better leader, for the very reason that I mentioned a while ago. I promise you, there is a gap between how you think you are perceived as a leader and how those that are under your leadership actually perceive who you are as a leader. That gap is an obvious blind spot, and it's the reason that we need to evaluate, look in the mirror. Here's what I see from leaders in churches with 50 people, 75 people, 500, or 5,000. Most leaders consume content. Most leaders are readers. They read books, they listen to podcasts, they attend webinars, conferences, consume as much leadership material as they can possibly consume. That's not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, trying to learn and become a better leader is a great thing. But here's the problem with consuming content just for the sake of consuming content. Consuming content is motivating, but it doesn't necessarily reveal the strengths and weaknesses that you have as an individual leader. But here's one of the problems, and it leads to your frustration, and it leads to the frustration of people that you're leading. And that is, you come back and you may make some adjustments, or after consuming, reading, listening, whatever content about leadership, you make some tweaks to changes, but it still doesn't reveal your strengths and weaknesses as a leader. And here's where the stakes get even more real for you as a church leader. Research shows that your leadership has a direct correlation between volunteer satisfaction and volunteer engagement. And I think all of us would agree that when volunteers are dissatisfied and disengaged, they eventually drop out. As a matter of fact, statistics show that 1/3 of all volunteers drop out after 12 months. Here's something even more staggering when you dig into the statistics. Even though that decision becomes public around the 12-month point, volunteers actually make a decision around the 6-month point whether they're going to stick or leave. Those first 6 months are what in volunteer life is referred to as the honeymoon phase. And leadership behavior is not the only factor in volunteer satisfaction, but it is a huge factor in volunteer satisfaction and volunteer engagement. So as a leader, you consume leadership content, you read a book, you listen to a podcast, you attend a conference or a webinar, any of those, and they're all great, as I said before. That creates motivation. Motivation creates movement, but it's not always movement in the right direction or not always movement in the best direction. In other words, you cannot hit a target you cannot see. If you don't have a tool or a strategy for helping you see what you need to see, then you're totally guessing or assuming about how you're doing as a leader. Now, here's the good news. There are some real tangible ways and tools for you to discover your leadership blind spots. There's some real tangible ways for a leader to look in the mirror and get an honest assessment of your current status as a leader. Now, I know this is a mouthful. Get pen and paper and write this down. But the full range of leadership model provides a tool to evaluate and measure your leadership. I'll expand a little bit more on this full range of leadership model. So this full range of leadership model, what makes this model so useful is that it does not just describe one ideal type of a leader. And it doesn't just tell you to become that specific person. What it does instead, it maps the entire spectrum of leadership behavior from the most engaged and transformational at the top to what researchers call passive leadership, which is obviously at the bottom. Here's some other things that the model does. The model identifies 3 distinct zones of leadership behaviors, beginning at the bottom with passive, in the middle being transactional, and the highest or at the top being transformational. So let's pick these up very quickly and begin at the bottom. At the bottom, passive leadership, or what is oftentimes referred to as laissez-faire leadership. Laissez-faire is just a French term which means let it be or let it go, which actually describes what passive leadership looks like, right? Passive leadership avoids making decisions. It avoids addressing problems. Going into hiding, it only comes out when someone calls on it. Here's the danger of passive or laissez-faire leadership. It's never overly dramatic. Researchers agree that passive leadership is the most destructive leadership, and it often shows up when a person is very good at one specific thing, but then treats leading people as a distraction. Let me tell you how this may show up in ministry. You may be very good at a specific area, fill in the blank, preaching, speaking to students, speaking to children. But if you're in a position of leadership, your responsibility is not only to be doing that one thing that you do very well, but God's called you to lead and equip other people. Let's quickly talk about the middle zone. The middle zone is transactional leadership, which frankly is where we as leaders oftentimes find ourselves, because what transactional leadership does is it does set expectations, creates tasks, but people either complete the task or they don't. Then the relationship between the leader and the team is essentially functional. Here's what I need you to do, and either they do it or they don't. Here's our mission statement. Now go and do it. Now, transactional leadership does create clarity of expectations. It does create clear expectations. But here's the thing to know about transactional leadership. That clarity of expectation is the ceiling as far as motivating and engaging volunteers. It does not equip people, does not motivate people, does not inspire people. It simply has a ceiling of letting people know what is expected and the direction that they need to be going in. Transactional leadership does not connect people with a ministry's overall mission and purpose or the church's overall mission and purpose, and it certainly doesn't connect them with God's mission. Transactional leadership simply manages the transaction between what needs to be done and whether or not it's getting done. Now, let's move to the top. Talk about transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is where the research consistently points when it comes to team engagement, performance, retention, and volunteer satisfaction. And it's what the rest of this episode and the rest of our discussion is going to be about. And we'll unpack this in some details and about what this looks like for church leaders. Transformational leadership focuses on the growth and development of people and not just organizational or team outputs. Transformational leadership is based on the principle that if you are developing and pouring into people, then those people will accomplish the mission and the goals that you're trying to accomplish. See, transformational leaders, they inspire, they motivate followers by serving as role models, being able to articulate a clear vision about where you're going, about being able to create an environment of creativity and empowering people, and by addressing the individual needs of the people that they lead. Now, transformational leadership is made up of 4 specific components. Today, we'll just mention these and we'll dive into them in more detail in the future. But transformational leadership has a measurable relationship to whether team members are engaged, satisfied, and committed. And imagine what the ministry or church you're leading would look like if all of the volunteers or the staff members that are part of your team were motivated, engaged, and committed. Now, the first factor of transformational leadership is what is referred to as idealized influence. This simply means that the leader is worth following. They have character, consistency, integrity, and trust. Second factor of transformational leadership is called inspirational motivation, which is about being able to communicate vision and mission and actually connecting people not only to a task, but what their responsibility is to accomplishing a greater purpose. Now, the third component of transformational leadership is referred to as intellectual stimulation. This simply means that you're inviting creativity, that you're asking people to help solve a problem, that you're giving people engagement and empowerment to be part of the solution and not simply giving them a task to perform. And the fourth component of transformational leadership is called individualized consideration. Now, I want to point out my research and other research has shown to be the top factor of transformational leadership, having the highest correlation with volunteer satisfaction inside of a local church. All that really means is this, is that a leader who takes the time to get to know a person's dreams, aspirations, get to know the person as an individual, causes that person to be more engaged and more satisfied than that person feeling like that they're just part of a larger group that no one cares about. It communicates to that person that the leader genuinely cares and is invested in the growth and development of this person. Now, we're going to spend a full episode on each of these in the future, but today I want you to be able to walk away with something much more simpler. What I want you to be able to do today is walk away knowing where you tend to operate as a leader, knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses. Because here is the honest truth. Most of us as leaders operate from a mix of all 3 zones, depending on the day, depending on the season, depending on the situation and circumstances. See, the goal is not to become a perfect transformational leader. What the goal is be able to see yourself clearly, to be able to look into the mirror and know your strengths, know your weaknesses, and know the areas that you need to be working on. So here's what I want you to do. If you're serious about looking in the mirror to get a good glimpse of who you are as a leader, then becoming a better leader, I'm going to give you 2 practical steps that you can take this week. I'm actually going to give you 2 practical steps you can take today. Take the multi-factor leadership questionnaire. Again, I know that's a mouthful. The multi-factor leadership questionnaire. do an internet search of the MLQ, obviously the initials MLQ-5X, which is a shorter version of the questionnaire. You can purchase it online for less than $2. Now, there are a couple of different things I'm going to ask you to do. They do have an option for you to rate yourself. I think this is very important. It's called, obviously, the self-rated test, where you are rating yourself as a leader. It's going to look at all four of these components that we talked about. But I'm going to ask you to rate yourself. That's step number one. Then I'm going to ask you to have a couple different people to evaluate and rate you as a leader. If you're leading staff members that are paid bivocational full-time by the church, I would encourage you to get a couple people that are directly under your leadership to rate you as a leader. Let them know up front there's not going to be any negative repercussions from their responses. There will always be, for every single one of us, there will be some strengths and some weaknesses. But I'm also going to ask you to have a volunteer, someone that will be honest. Have them to evaluate who you are as a leader. They can do it on a hard copy. They can do it electronically. When you do this, you're going to find the gap between how you view your leadership and how others that you lead perceive your leadership. This is huge for any leader to be able to shorten that gap and to put a magnifying glass on some of those blind spots that every single one of us have. Every single one of us as leaders have our strongest areas and we have our weakest areas of leadership. The key is being honest, getting honest feedback. Then suddenly you're able to identify areas that you need to improve. Now, think with me for a second what this looks like within a local church context. Imagine more people being engaged in ministry. Imagine the ability to be able to scale your leadership by helping the people around you become better leaders. How does this help you, and how does this help your church accomplish your unique part in God's Great Commission? Now, a couple things I'm going to ask. If this is helpful to you, here's what you can do next. Subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Another thing you can do is share this with another church leader. Comment below. Which of the four do you need to grow in the most? And if you want to build a church where volunteers don't just serve, but thrive and engaged in ministry, stay with me. That's what this channel is all about.